Then let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, as we move into this Advent season, our hearts are excited because we look again with hope for the day when you will come in our lives in ways that grabs us by the scruff of the neck and leads us into your closer presence. Be with us now as we talk about your word and archaeology and all those kind of things, in the hopes that in that process they too may bring us to new levels of excitement. Let it be for us this day the advent of new understanding. Amen. Well, we're back almost where we started. You may remember that when we started this series, we started on Mount Sinai and talked about all the issues there. And then we got into so many issues at Sinai that we spent 2 weeks on it. And then we came across into what's now Jordan, the land of Moab, and the land of the Edomites. And we came north to Mount Nebo, where Moses was allowed to see the promised land, but not enter it, and where he is supposedly buried. And then we crossed the Jordan River and went through Joshua's, having taken over the leadership of the tribes now. Joshua and the tribes conquered Jericho. And then, of course, we went north from there, finally spending a whole lot of time in the Galilee and then rushing back through Jerusalem. And now we're back at Jericho again because it's a tremendously kind of significant place, and a lot of us know some things about Jericho. People that don't know much about the Bible can probably sing the old spiritual, Josh fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. We all know that. So Jericho has some interesting things. And if you don't know about the walls of Jericho coming tumbling down, you certainly know about that short fellow in the tree called Zacchaeus, who saw Jesus going through the town of Jericho, a tax collector. So Jericho has played an interesting place. It's not mentioned hugely in the Bible, but the times it is mentioned, it's kind of huge. Jesus, depending on which gospel you read, healed Bartimaeus, the blind man in Jericho. And or if you read Matthew, he healed 2 blind men in Jericho. It otherwise is identically the same story. You can almost, like acetate pages, lay the stories on top of each other in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that there's this story in Jericho. So I thought maybe go back one more time with what we've learned archaeologically speaking and look at Jericho. Jericho, if it weren't in the Bible at all, would be significant to us because it's thought to be by most the oldest urban civilization in history. It celebrated last year its 11,000th birthday. Been around for a while, okay? Goes back to the Natufian period, and it is just remarkable place. They probably weren't Hebrews in Jericho in that day because 11,000 years ago Abraham hadn't been born yet, and Abraham is the father of Judaism, so we don't get Judaism on the scene of history until about 1800 BCE. And it's just, well, it's fascinating, so I thought I'd go back. The picture on the front page is very significant. This tower is thought to be 7,000 years old on the front page, page 1. And you see a hole in the center. That's because there's a stairway of 22 stone steps coming up that tower. The tower is dated approximately 7,000 BCE. And it's not a newcomer there because, if it's 11,000 BC, then it's 4,000 years old when they built the tower. It's almost impossible to get one's arms around the significance of this place in the development of civilization in the Middle East. Been around a long time. Behind it, you see one of the parts of a wall. On the left side, if you look down at the bottom and trace it at a 45-degree angle upward, you'll see a black line. Do you see the black line there? I'm not hearing. Do you see it? Yes. Okay, fine. Thank you. So what does that mean? Fire. Exactly right. And that fire, if you see, it's reflected in the tower as well. So sometime after the tower, it's higher than the tower. We're down to bedrock with the tower. It's higher than the tower. So it tells us that the city was burned. And so does the Bible tell us that the city was burned. There's also on page 2, I believe you'll find it. You got to trust me because it's hard to tell from this picture. If I'd have made it the size of half a page, it'd be clearer. This is an archaeologist pointing to the mud bricks that have tumbled down, and they were the foundation of a wall on top of it. You see some of the wall up at the top. But the mud bricks are at the bottom. They have crumbled and fallen down. Of course, the Bible tells us about the walls came tumbling down. Well, here clearly that has happened. So that this is one of the things about archaeology that can drive you absolutely nuts. Because here we have a burn line. Here we have the walls came tumbling down. And you say, see, the Bible tells us the truth. Well, that's where the trouble comes. Because while those things have happened and while the Bible knows about those things, when Joshua got there, if we have Joshua dated correctly, when Joshua got there, it was about 150 years too late. All these things by carbon dating happened before Joshua got there. Best evidence is that Jericho was not inhabited when Joshua got there. Well, of course, that makes it easier to march around it 7 days, blow the trumpet, and the thing falls down if it wasn't occupied anyway. But then you have the story about Rahab hiding the spies and all that kind of thing that builds up to this story. And they're sparing Rahab and her family. And as the Bible tells it, as she lived with the Israelite people until this day. Well, I haven't met her, and I've been there several times. But at any rate, the issue comes now very difficult because while we're talking in terms of thousands of years, to miss it by 140 years, that's pretty close. We should celebrate it and call it like horseshoes. You get points for being close and go on. But 150 years when you're dating something is a long miss. It's twice my lifetime. So that the bottom line is none of us live to that kind of time. So if you missed it by 150 years, in all extents and purposes, you done missed it. And it's, what's wrong? How do we date Joshua? We date Joshua from the Egyptian Pharaoh line because the Bible tells us that the Hebrew children were slaves making mud brick in the Nile Delta for Ramses II. We know, or think we know, when Ramses II reigned. And therefore we think we know when the Exodus was. And therefore we think we know after the years of wandering that the Bible describes pretty clearly, we can factor it down to when the Israelites attacked Jericho. And we say about 1400 BCE when Joshua got there. And it looks like the destruction happened in 1550 BCE. Now, so we're counting backward. They're not counting up, we're counting backward now. So that means by carbon dating of this evidence, we missed it by 150 years. And you say, well, maybe you're wrong with Ramses, and we could take the whole line of Pharaoh history, shift it back 150 years, then it all works. But that dishevels then a lot that we think we know pretty definitely about Egypt. So you fix one thing and you unhook 36 other things, and nobody's really anxious to do that. There is one archaeologist currently working, currently living, who swears and argues that his testing and his work on this issue shows 1400 BC. That would make them come together. I put his picture. This is the guy. Glock is his last name. This is the guy. I put his picture in the paper just so he'd give him some publicity, because there isn't another writing archaeologist that agrees with him. Takes some chutzpah to stand out there alone and say, all the rest of you are wrong. But if you want to believe that they have to match somehow. So Jericho becomes, in that sense, a real conflicting, it's so close, 150 years. But 150 years late is a long time. To put it in perspective, it hasn't been all that long ago that we celebrated the 200th anniversary of American independence. But you go to George Washington's house and it does look like it was a long time ago. Am I making any sense at all as you talk about? So it seems when we're talking thousands of years, to haggle about 150 seems rather much. But so far that remains unsolved. Can there be more digging done at Jericho? Well, maybe there was some done recently, nothing great discovered. And the problem is it was dug in the mid-1800s when archaeology was not the scientific discipline that it is today. And in the 1920s, John Garstang dug it, and he too thought he had matched Joshua with the destruction of Jericho, but later totally undid his timing and agreed with the others. But the first people that dug it were German archaeologists who instead of digging, there are times I wish I had a chart pad. Instead of digging a waffle iron grid, are you following me at this? Plot out a grid 3 or 6 feet squares, drop perpendiculars down there, leaving a bulk, B-A-L-K, a wall. I want to tell you, you get to be like mountain sheep when you work an archaeological dig, because as the dig progresses, those 6-foot squares get deeper, and you walk across the thing on the bulks like this. I would never try it now. I couldn't lift the cane long enough to hold me up. But they drop a bulk right down, and the wall is never destroyed. So you have what's called the stratigraphy, the levels of occupation. You read the stratigraphy. You can stand at the bottom and you can see the levels of occupation. You can see mud, beaten earth floors. They don't have to be paved, just beaten earth. You can see that when you dig straight down and care for the stratigraphy. But they didn't do it in those times. They simply made a big X like this across the mound. Imagine a big round mound and a big X that goes down to bedrock. And you pile up some debris somewhere away from in the trash area. And you can't put it back. Dig, dug, gone. So that it's almost impossible to dig the most significant areas, such as this tower. Again, because it has been dug and the other dirt thrown into waste piles. And that same thing happened at the Temple Mount, by the way, after the 67 war. The imam on the top of the mount, which you're reading about all the time today about this kind of thing, dug the Temple Mount and dumped the debris over the side. And the Israeli archaeologists finally got permission to sort the pile. And you can't believe what they found by sifting that pile of debris. They found coins, they found artifacts, they found, well, just, it's unbelievable. They've been digging in those piles for 10 years now. So some parts that you're really interested in about Jericho are not there to be dug anymore. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so it isn't necessarily a rewarding dig. Questions or comments about that whole issue of Jericho and archaeology at this point? The Bible says it was burned. There is a burned line. You can see it yourself. The Bible said the wall came tumbling down. The walls did tumble at some point. They were made of mud brick, and that sounds like not very important, but mud brick once baked in the ancient world was tremendously strong and a whole lot less heavy than stones. Any comments or questions? You would like for me to come and say, it matches. And I have to come and say, at the moment, it doesn't match. Gluck being understood that he says it does. But he's taken a lot of grief for that. Yes, sir.
How do these structures compare with...
I'm sorry, I got to get back where I can hear you, sir.
How do these structures or walls or stone compare with the structures that you find in Egypt, in the Sudan, and Zimbabwe?
Egypt was much further along. These are pretty primitive structures at this point. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know about Zimbabwe. You will know more about that than I
the structures
do.
are 6 foot wide walls, and then somewhere they are held.
The first wall at Jericho is 6 feet wide and 12 feet high.
Yeah. I think Zimbabwe the temple, the Acropolis, is much higher than 12 feet.
Well, civilization develops at different times. For example, when the Israelites moved into the Promised Land, they were always losing to the Philistines. It was David who gets the credit for finally quieting down the Philistines. But the difficulty was the Philistines were in the Iron Age and the Israelites were still in the Bronze Age. And a bronze sword won't stand up to an iron sword any day. So they kept losing. But, 100 years later, when David comes on the scene, he begins winning because they both had iron then. So civilizations progress at different paces. Okay? And in different parts of the world, it's more dramatic, perhaps. Well, other stories, of course, the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus, and the sycamore tree, they will, there's no reason, archaeologically speaking, to question the story of Zacchaeus, the sycamore tree, or his repentance. When Jesus comes to his house after dinner, he says he'll give half of everything he has to the poor, and if he's defrauded anybody, he'll restore it 4 times. That's a marvelous story. And there's no reason not to say that that story is, at least as far as we want to say from the Scripture, to be believed. The only problem with the Zacchaeus story is if you go there, and many do, they will show you Zacchaeus' sycamore tree. And it is one old sucker, and it's in the page. I think I managed to sneak it in on the last page here. Yep, there it is. If you look at the trunk of that thing, it's huge, and it's. I even have one picture with people sitting on limbs of that tree. But I've noted probably not the sycamore tree. Is it a sycamore tree? Yeah. Is it ancient? Yeah, pretty ancient, yeah. It looks a little like the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the buses all take you there, and everybody jumps off the bus and clicks pictures of it and all that kind of thing. But there are 3 Jerichos. There's the Jericho Mound, which goes all the way back to 11,000 years ago. As the Jericho Mound, there's New Testament Jericho, which is 1.6 kilometers away, roughly about a mile. And there's kilometers, rather, roughly about a mile. And then there's modern Jericho, which is on the other side of the mound, and therefore perhaps 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the New Testament Jericho. The New Testament Jericho was actually built by Cyrus, the king of Persia, because he repopulated Jericho after the exile of the Jewish people. And he built it, 3rd century. And it is, as I said, about 1.6 kilometers away from the old mound. Same thing in Gaithersburg, because I saw an address from Main Street, and I assumed it was down here where the train goes across the track, and really it's way the heck out on the other side of town in a new mall. So the town has moved. You're laughing, you know what I'm talking about there. Well, towns move, and Jericho has moved at least 3 times. And then finally, the modern contemporary town today is on the other side of the mound by about the same space. In fact, it brushes against the mound. The mound is known as Tel es Sultan, which is the Arabic for it. At any rate, the New Testament town would have been back in the area that Cyrus resuscitated. And they've done some digging there, but not enough for anybody to go there these days. And there are no sycamore trees. I've been there. So this has to substitute. So the only part that archaeology dashes is we don't any longer have the sycamore tree. After that, the story is fine. Jesus healing Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, or Jesus heals two blind beggars. According to Matthew, no reason. The only difference is in the Bible stories, they're almost verbatim the same, except in one of them, Jesus is leaving Jericho, and the other, he's arriving in Jericho. But after that, the story is identically the same. No problem there. Archaeology can't help us much with that. Then comes the parable of the Good Samaritan. There is a location on the old Jericho Road, and honest, the old Jericho Road, the setting for this parable, still exists and can still be traveled. And along the way, about halfway, there are the ruins that have been called the Inn of the Good Samaritan. It has an ancient well. Now, ancient wells, because they're rare, water is a commodity, and I'll talk about that in the next section. Wherever there's an ancient well, one can assume there was some civilization around that well because it's a water source. Well, no pun intended. I've been at the Inn of the Good Samaritan. Its remnants probably suggest a somewhat later date, but the well seems to be authentically 1st century or before. So it could be the Inn of the Good Samaritan, except that was a parable. Even the Gospels don't claim that there is an Inn of the Good Samaritan. You can't use your credit card there, although the Good Samaritan did. However, on this last trip, 2 weeks ago, my mind was shattered to discover that the Israeli Department of Antiquities now has an archaeological site at the Inn of the Good Samaritan. Now, I didn't go to hear their explanation, but it seems like that the Israelis, seeing another way to get some tourist dollars, has authenticated the story. I just wanted to report that to you. That's new information, but it's not archaeological. Kind of fun. Before I go on, any questions about those things? I've just commented on what surrounds Jericho. Now, I have to confess that my great desire always is to have the scripture and the story and the evidence come together. Sometimes archaeology does that for us. Sometimes it doesn't. One of the places it does is in Jerusalem, as I mentioned last week, in Warren's water shaft and all those kind of things. This takes us right back to Uriah's climbing up the water shaft to get into the city, to unlock the gates, so in the middle of the night, David's army could march into the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. The stuff is there, and archaeology says, yeah, that was possible. Some people have actually climbed up that ancient shaft to prove that it can be done. So, that's sort of interesting, okay? That little tidbit of how David got into the city turns out to be probably dependable. And we think we know how he did it. Again, questions? Yes?
Why in, like Jericho and Herat in Afghanistan, which had caught my attention. Why were they conquered and everybody killed, but then the conquerors left and didn't really stay and take over the cities at the time of conquest? What was I mean, obviously they didn't like who was living there, but nor did they want the cities because they didn't stay.
Well, first of all, it was the ancient way of doing war. This is bottom line. You don't want to defeat an enemy and then go north and leave them behind you. They make friends with others of your enemies, and soon you're in deep trouble.
So they would just do it and then go back where they came from?
Right? No, they were conquering a whole land, so they're moving on, but they couldn't leave a hostile city behind them. Most of the time they rebuilt the city and repopulated it. Because of the hostility with Jericho, Joshua ruled that nobody should live except Rahab and her family.
So it could be a span of years in between the conquest and the genocide before anyone came back and took it over.
Could be.
Rebuilt.
Often wasn't. Could be, often wasn't. At Jericho, there was some bad blood there, and that was just done. Of course, the Bible would say God told him to do it.
Yeah.
Okay? And you know, Solomon didn't do it when God said to do it. Kill all the animals, kill everything. And Solomon thought, well, the animals are worth something. Why don't we keep those? And people of merit he thought was still useful to his society. So he kept these people. That's why God said to Solomon, you can no longer be king. You didn't do what I told you. Our image of God has changed dramatically from that culture where God was simply another warrior god like the rest of them.
Well, I did find it shocking in reading the history when our son was there in Afghanistan that it was exactly as you said. They killed everything, and they went back just to make sure they didn't miss somebody.
Look at what ISIL is doing in Iraq. They're doing exactly the same thing, mostly killing.
Because what it surprised me is their own armies had to eat. Why would they kill all the animals so they couldn't eat? But
yeah, without deep freezers, they had to eat it fast, you know. So, yeah, I'm not trying to be cynical about that. I'm just saying that it was not a productive way to do things. That doesn't help you much, but that's the way it was. That's the way they fought in those days. You can't leave an enemy behind you. You know, if you want to go forward and you defeated the enemy, you can't let him reorganize and come back. We did that in Iraq, you know. That's what we did. We killed off their army, but not others who could rearm, and the rest is history. Any other questions? Well, let me go on. Let's talk a little bit about the pictures that you see next. This is the Jordan River. Would to God it looked like this all the time. Most of the time it's a creek, not much wider than the seat of your chair. By the time you get down to the lower part of the Jordan, just before it flows into the Dead Sea. This is a picture I took in January of last year. It had rained cats. Even that day there was nothing but ankle-deep mud in this area. But I got out a little bit that I could take this picture. And I've been there other times when, as I said, it would be maybe this wide from one side to the other. Why is that? There are several reasons. The first is that the Jordan River of Jesus' day would have been a happily running, babbling brook of some significant water supply, even as it got to the Dead Sea in Jesus' time. The water from the water to form the River Jordan comes from the snows of Mount Hermon that melt. And those snows that melt are also fed by a couple small rivers and brooks north of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is fed by underground springs, some of them saline, but because saline is heavier, the amount of water keeps the salt toward the bottom. And then the Jordan River flows all the way down what we might call the Holy Land, separating Jordan from Israel today. In fact, it's the border between Jordan and Israel for most of the trip down to the Dead Sea. And on both sides of the river, even though they have a peace treaty today, there are still active minefields. I don't know, twice to 3 times the width of this room, going to the Jordan River from both sides. So it isn't the case you take the family in a picnic basket and spread a blanket and have a picnic along the banks of the Jordan River, except for the access both countries have created to assist the development of this new baptism site. And there you can go all the way to the edge of the Jordan, and they have, like your backyard deck has steps on it, made of the same material. They have steps that walk down into the Jordan River for doing baptisms at the site on the west side, which is Israel, and at the site on the east side, which is Jordan. Back to the river. The river is the main aquifer of both Jordan and Israel. It is depended upon to feed the ever-increasing population of both countries, and is called upon to irrigate the planting of both countries. So that by the time it gets down, I'd like to tell you, the treaty with Jordan requires Israel to pump and supply to Jordan, I want to say something like 150 million gallons, but I don't want to publish that, but it's an incredible amount of water to Jordan. And they do every year meet that requirement. But between that much shipped to Jordan and certainly that much shipped to Israel and its agricultural enterprises, there is a tremendous pumping of the River Jordan. Worse than that, there's not enough water even then to sustain the population, so that particularly in the Palestinian territories, Israel is known to shut the water off for 2 days, so that you'll see on the top of roofs these huge storage tanks, which are painted black because that helps heat the water. And the tank stores the water so that if Israel shuts the water off, they can survive 2 or 3 days with hot water. But the problem is there isn't enough water to go around to do all the things that need to be done. And the Jordan River is the aquifer for both of those nations. Now, when you have a bad season, when the snows don't come to Mount Hermon, it is dramatic. Nowadays, and I could have put that picture in, on the Sea of Galilee at the primacy of Peter's site, where supposedly they caught the fish after the resurrection, and Jesus had this fish fry for breakfast for them. At that location, the shore that I remember was up lapping the foundations of the Church of the Primacy of Peter, with steps going down into the water and 3 or 4 steps underwater. It is now probably 200, 250 yards from those steps out to the bank of the Sea of Galilee. It's just an unbelievable loss of water. There's still the Sea of Galilee, and you can still take boat rides and everything, but it is shrinking because of the water being taken out, and because of years when the rainfall, the precipitation, is low. You know, they have a tradition, goes all the way back to Joseph in Egypt, a tradition of 7 fat years and 7 lean years. And that still pretty well holds. If they've got a bad year, they're likely to have several bad years in a row, and then they begin to get more rain. Every time I go there, it rains, so they want me to come more often. And you know, you get a rain in Jerusalem, and you know, it's no fun sightseeing in the rain. But the guide and the bus driver and everybody you talk to says, man, is this great. We hope we get weeks of it. And I said, yeah, after I leave. But anyhow, excuse me, the water collection system is, in fact, the Jordan River. So by the time it gets down to the end of its run, a mile or so from the Dead Sea, there's not much left of the Jordan River anymore. It had rained so hard that day when I was there that you couldn't see through the rain. We didn't get out of the bus to see Jerash, a major place. And by the time we got here, it had stopped raining and the Jordan River was going nuts. It was probably 5 to 6 feet higher than it should have been when I took this picture. The picture down below here is of the reconstruction, renovation, preservation of 3rd and 4th century ruins at the baptism site in Jordan. At that point, what you see here is a pool, and it comes in from the Jordan as a feeding moat, trench, what are you going to call it, to the left of this picture that comes in to feed this baptismal pool thing, and these are foundations of 3rd, 4th century construction. There are terrazzo floors all over this place, and all of this has been found in the last 10 years ago with the help of UNESCO after the peace treaty with Jordan. This is, you couldn't get here. People suspected it was here, but because it's no man's land, there was no way to dig it archaeologically. So this is 10 years, perhaps, and back to what 3rd and 4th century Christians believed was the site of the baptisms of John the Baptist and perhaps of Jesus' baptism. On page 4, you see Pope Francis prepares to enter the water there. It looks like he's trying to see how cold it is before he gets in, or how slippery it was. And that's a picture from this year's visit. So that early Christians believed, obviously, there's tremendous building foundations here, a lot of different directions, huge terrazzo floors, which indicate that this was a place of high activity for Christians. Doesn't look like all that much today, but they've put a roof over the big area with a great big terrazzo floor. And of course, if you have a great number of people, you can do a service there. And like I said, there's a picture of Pope Francis on those very steps down, about to step into the water. So what does archaeology tell us about that? It probably has located where John was operating in his baptisms. Does it prove that Jesus was baptized here? No. But what it does tell us is that the early Christians in the 3rd and 4th century believed that this was the place where John baptized. So it's kind of interesting. It's new information. We didn't have it 10 years or so ago. Questions? Have I bored you right out of your gourds here? It's probably claiming too much to claim that it's the site where Jesus was baptized, but it's the best shot at that statement that we've got at this stage. Yeah?
Actually, it's going back a little bit, thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan.
I'm sorry?
Remembering the phrasing.
Wait a minute, I lost what you said there.
Oh, back to the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Oh, okay, sure, go ahead.
Thinking of the phrasing, was it sort of, is it reasonable that there would be an inn in the sense that Jesus is telling a story about a place people are, and it'd be like if he was talking about a parable here, but when you go down, Shady Grove Road and you hang a left on whatever, and
sure,
so you would
sure.
just tell the story to match what's there.
the road to Jericho was notorious for criminal activity. We know that from other sources. So that there would have been an inn or a resting place along that road, somewhere midway between Jerusalem and Jericho, is altogether probable. It may well be that it's a story that reoccurred often, over and again, and Jesus is simply constructing a parable from what happens pretty regularly. Okay? And what's the parable about it is neatly saying, well, first a Pharisee came by, and then a priest, and then a Levite, and nobody did anything. And these were religious people who would have been expected to do something. So Jesus has spun the story to make more of a point than the fact that you could stay at the Holiday Inn along the road here. But that it was likely there could have been a place of overnight lodging, or even likely. I don't have any problem with the story, because I think Jesus often took stories from the things that happened every day around them and spun them to make his point. So was it there? The well was, and so therefore I would guess maybe there was some likelihood there was some way to get support or meal or whatever. What they would do in those days is, you could make a Sabbath day journey only of so many steps because of the Pharisaic law. But if you were walking to your next meal, which the law always provided for, that you could do, then you could pay your servant to go out and hide lunches all the way down, or if it took more time, build a McDonald's stand, and you could always walk to the next lunch bag. That wasn't against the law. So people did these kind of things, leaving themselves exposed to the thievery that would happen when these, for example, they left him on the road half dead. Remember the story? They fell upon him, left him half dead. They didn't kill him. And that was a practice they used. If the man was dead, you wouldn't stop, you just keep going. But if the person was alive, any person of reasonable conscience would try to assist that person. And then the robbers would hit them too. That was the game plan. And so Jesus tells the story as we suspect the Jericho road. I guess it happened there many, many times. How many people are willing to leave their Visa card with the innkeeper and not, as the story kind of suggests, when I come back, I'll pay you, kind of thing. I don't know whether that was something that ever happened or whether Jesus just took the story in that direction. Did that answer the question at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Come on, some more questions like that. Well, hearing none, I'm sorry.
Going way back, when you're talking about Jericho being 11,000 years old, and I was wondering if you had anything to say about that. Wasn't the Ice Age ending around that time?
It was indeed. Thanks for raising the question. Jericho, the question was, so everybody can hear, wasn't the Ice Age ending about that time? The answer is yes. At about 11,000, no, it would be 7,000 BCE. We had 2,000, 3,000 years more now to our time. But yes, the age of the Ice Age was just coming to a close at that time. And at the beginning, it would have been too cold for Jericho to sustain large settlements. And what was there in these large times were mud brick igloo kind of houses, round, about 16 feet around, clustered together and then walled in. But that was the time the climate was already changing just a bit, so that by another few hundred years, it became the tropical oasis that it is today. But you're exactly right. That time takes it right back to the transition moment from late Ice Age kind of things. Good question. Yeah.
Actually, something from earlier in your talk. You mentioned that I don't know if that was a joke or if it was actually they're that precise, that they celebrated their 11,000th year
Yeah.
last year. Is there are they able to be just that precise, or is that just more of a fun thing somebody?
Yeah, they inherited the date, so they just decided to use it. When did it? What constitutes an urban center? Do 30 houses in an era when everybody was herdsmen and they wandered? Does 30 houses with a wall or 300 houses as a wall? You can pick any continuum along there. And there's, for example, the first kind of urban development is thought to have been 30 houses. Others have said 300. But the date has been just set by carbon dating of some of the stuff there, and so they rounded off and picked that date. Good question again. You'd think after everything I said about 150 years is a lot of time to be wrong. You'd think that we're kind of slippery and dirty about selecting dates, and to some degree you have to be. Carbon dating, for example, has a span of about 150 years in most things, from here to here kind of thing. So when we come with carbon dating to 1400 BCE, that will probably be one end. And where do you want it to be? Well, I want it to be when Joshua came, so you take this end of it, but it could be at the other end too. So it's not precise, but it's a good question. Yeah?
Because of the very dry climate there, have they recovered?
I'm going to come back there where I can hear you.
Yeah. Because of the very dry climate there, have they recovered wood, and do they have tree ring chronologies for any of that far back?
Some of it, yes.
Okay.
Some of it, yes. But it hasn't always been that way, and it isn't always as dry as we sometimes think. They get rains too pretty heavily at seasons of the year. But it's like an oasis. The palm trees, the orange tree, the citrus, date trees, date palms. Incredible. It was 80 degrees 2 weeks ago when I was down there. When it was 30 here, it was 80 at Jericho. So, but that whole area can be a little that way. I had short sleeve white shirts on most of the time, even in the evenings. In Jerusalem, that kind of thing. And in Tiberias. Tiberias goes up and down and is, of course, more damp than Jerusalem is. You can't do your laundry and put it on the hotel balcony in Tiberias. But you can in Jerusalem. The hotel doesn't like it, but you can do it. Well, thank you all very much. Time has lapsed. If there are other questions, I'm here. Thank you all for being here on the weekend of Thanksgiving. Good to have you. Next week, by the way, we're going to talk about, what does the Old Testament tell us about Jesus? And I don't know, because I'm working on this just like you're going to be. So I do know some things, but we'll be talking about how the Messianic dream began to grow. And I'll review that historically. And then what prophets began to look to the Messiah as the way to save Israel. And then what they expected the Messiah to be. And then how did the New Testament writers look back to the Old Testament to substantiate a different kind of Messiah. I think it should be fun. But I can't have archaeological data on that one. We're just going to buff that one out. And we'll mix it with Advent hymns and so forth and so forth. Thank you so much, all of you.
Actually, a question totally unrelated to this, so I didn't ask it.
That's okay.
But it's coming up. I actually talked to Pastor Matt about it on the men's retreat. So it came up there, and it comes up in the reading today. The business with Paul and Jesus, a lot of Peter we were talking about then, but the idea that all these people